In 1982, it was quiet and typifying Boston suburbia in the Massachusetts town of Medford. It was a small yet booming commercial community where its cash-flowing businesses were painted into an image of security and prosperity. In the middle of this financial hub sat Depositors Trust, the wealthiest and most prestigious bank in town. Ornate and lavishly decorated, it featured a vault reinforced with 18 inches of solid concrete, sealed behind massive steel doors. Inside, thousands of double-key safety deposit boxes overflowed with cash, jewels, and priceless heirlooms. The alarms were tied directly to the alarm company and the police station, adding another layer of supposedly foolproof security. The bank was impenetrable, or so everyone thought. On Memorial Day weekend in 1980, something horrific happened. Early Tuesday morning, when it opened again, the bank commemorated the start of an inquiry into the New England region's largest bank robbery in history. There was, allegedly, a disappearance of more than $10 million in cash and jewels. Once thought to be invulnerable, the vault had given way, and more than 1,000 safety deposit boxes had been smashed open. Oddly, the highly sophisticated silent alarm hadn't been set off. Unbelievable was it further that a hole had been blasted in the reinforced concrete ceiling. It was just such a scenario from a movie that had played out in this heist. Immediately, there was recourse to the FBI. Even after exhausting search, no fingerprints, no burglary tools were found, no eyewitness. The culprits had left behind no trace. It was, in each and every way, a crime of perfection. As a word of the robbery spread, the story grew to become a major thing within Medford, and soon at state and federal levels. The question was, who could it be? No one suspected anybody because, so far, no one identified any suspect. Therefore, according to investigators, it would have to have been a very professional crew. Little did many people know. The mastermind behind this heist was neither an outsider nor a new face, but an experienced law enforcement officer, Police Captain Jerry Clemente. A career policeman, Clemente had managed to orchestrate the $10 million bank robbery with finesse and precision. No ordinary policeman, Clemente was a widely respected figure in society, obsessed with the concept of money and power, but living a double life. For years, Clemente had been slipping into crime, ever since that first night on the police force. With his old hand partner Crusher, Clemente had learned a critical lesson about corruption. One night, he and Crusher had caught a guy running down the street with a stolen lawn chair. To Clemente's surprise, Crusher knew the guy as a fellow cop. Crusher told the young officer a simple thing: if you see another cop with stolen goods, mind your own business. This was Clemente's first taste of the system where corruption was not only tolerated but ingrained. This first experience in corruption fueled his downward slide into the world of crime. He learned to plan and execute a burglary nicely, which eventually helped him furnish his entire house with stolen goods. But even as he increasingly turned to life as a criminal, he continued to live up to a reputation as a fearless and effective cop. In fact, at an early point in his career, he received a Medal of Valor for his part in the arrest of an armed gangster. To those who knew him, Clemente was the embodiment of the good cop, someone on whom you could rely under the most trying circumstances. But beneath this mask, Clemente had a life of duplicity, not only as a crook but also in his personal life. Though married with children, he had a secret mistress, a further example of his love of living a double life. It was a complex mix of honor and corruption that allowed Clemente to plan and carry out one of the most brazen robberies of the century, feeling all the while that he was invincible. Jerry Clemente's criminal ambitions continued to develop as with his advancement in the law enforcement forces. Now, with Sergeant Tom Dye as his partner, the two increased their focus on more audacious crimes. Sergeant Tom Dye, like Clemente, was a rogue cop who was boastful and senselessly abused his power from the very day he joined the force in 1978. The two together proved to be a convincing team, clandestinely running their lives as rogues amidst being police officers. Their first big inside operation was a brazen scam aimed directly at the police department itself. Clemente and Dye stole the police promotional exam, which had yet to be administered, made copies, and sold them for $5,000 to would-be officers seeking promotions. They consolidated power and influence by manipulating who got into key command positions in the various city and town police departments. At that time, the system was controlled by the best of Clemente and Dye, which kept all things going well, and their criminal network continued expanding. But their avarice only grew, and 1980 brought to Clemente and Dye the chance to become multi-millionaires. The target, Depositors Trust, the largest and most secure bank in Medford. This was no average heist. This was the big score, the one they believed would set them up for life. Millions of cash and jewels locked away. They knew this was the heist that could change everything. Tom Dye's inside connection proved to be the ticket. A customer and owner of his own safety deposit box inside the bank, Dye had unfettered access to the building, which he exploited. Dye measured the distance of the vault in his head and even marked where the safes and deposit boxes stood. With this in mind, Clemente knew they needed a specialized team to get the job done. He hired another corrupt cop, Joe Banks, and a notorious gangster called Brother Olier. There was, however, a glaring trouble. The bank's advanced alarm system was directly connected to the Metro Police Station and the alarm company as well. They needed an expert, and Clemente knew just the man, Bucky Barrett. Bucky Barrett was a professional burglar and an expert in bypassing alarm systems. He knew the silent alarm, which would send the authorities in without the burglars knowing anything, was their biggest headache. For 2 months, Bucky and Clemente showed up every night at the bank, carefully trying each wire in order to see which controlled the alarm. Bucky constructed a device that could block the outgoing alarm signal, enabling them to disable the system unsuspectedly. It was a cumbersome chore, but they knew it had to be done precisely. While they were mapping out the plan, Clemente and his gang went on reconnaissance patrols, dry runs, and staked out the bank like seasoned cops watching a crime scene. They planned every minute detail with painstaking precision, as if robbing a bank would be just like preparing for a coordinated police operation. Cemented in their plan, Clemente set the date, Memorial Day weekend 1980. The time was perfect. Throughout Memorial Day weekend, the town had promoted all the events, from a carnival till late hours, meaning noise and mayhem, the optimal mask for the burglary. It was now time to get serious, put together everything that would be required for the night. Acetylene torches, dynamite, magnesium burning rods, and carbide core bits for drilling. They prepared for every imaginable complication that might occur and left nothing to chance. On the eve of the robbery, the gang took up their position. Clemente was assured they would not be detected because of their lookout man, namely Sergeant Tom Dye, the senior cop on duty throughout the whole city of Medford that night. If anyone approached the bank or came too close, DI could easily send them away or simply play the role of a concerned police officer patrolling around. With everything set up now, Clemente pulled off the scheme. This would involve first passing by the alarm at the rear of the building. Having disabled the alarm, Clemente then broke open a shop next to the bank, enabling him to gain entry into the upper loft space in the shop's attic. From this loft, they smashed through the wall which led directly into the bank. This cinder block wall was easy to break through, and soon they were inside the crawl space above the vault. From this vantage point, they began drilling through the actual ceiling of the vault. Powered by a nearby fuse box, they used their specialized tools to create a hole in the reinforced concrete. Thanks to Dee's earlier reconnaissance, they knew exactly where to drill. They prepared well, working with military precision in the execution of their excellently crafted plan. Everything was calculated for the success that they wanted: the tools, the timing, even the cover provided by the holiday noise. It was a purely planned operation, carried out in the same manner of discipline and attention to detail that they had learned in all the years of law enforcement careers by Clemente and Dye. In fact, they were professionals who treated this heist not as some sort of criminality, but rather as an extension of their police work. For Clemente, it marked the culmination of years of corruption, planning, and pure risk-taking. It was all about to pay off. Jerry Clemente's crew crept through the job step by step, carefully checking with Tom Dye to make sure they were not seen. Dye, ever vigilant, scanned the area and sent back a signal if it was okay to continue on. Then disaster struck. Owners of Brigham's restaurant next door happened to count inventory at midnight. Instantly, Clemente changed his attention to Dee, who then sprang into action. With his newfound role as a policeman, he sent the owners packing within the facade of greater security concerns due to the recent thefts by criminals. The owners, pleased with the swift response by the police, disappeared into thin air without a problem. The coast being now clear, Dye was ready to give a sign to Clemente to carry on with his operation. The gang kept drilling into the hard, steel-reinforced concrete vault ceiling. Still, Clemente wanted to speed things up, so he elected to employ dynamite, even though he might well blow himself and everyone around him sky high. They were working in the middle of Medford, not exactly where one wants to make a noise. However, they prepared a block of dynamite with a layer of sandbags atop it to deaden the sound. It was fortunate that no one reported the explosion, and whatever noise was heard was probably not noticed and drowned by the lively carnival sounds coming from a Memorial Day get-together going on in the area. Dynamite did the trick and dislodged the concrete, but the vault was also lined with wire mesh, requiring tedious cutting with an acetylene torch. It was already 3 a.m. after hours of hard labor when they finally broke through the vault ceiling. Inside, they found the vault covered in dust and debris, but they got to work on their prime object of attack, the cash safe of the bank. Bucky Barrett, their alarms and safes man, began cutting through the hinges at the bottom of the safe using the torch, while the others prized open safety deposit boxes. To their bitter disappointment, though, the gang finally broke open the cash safe. Despite all their careful planning over months and despite high expectations, the safe only yielded $60,000, all but a fraction of what they expected. Because of the Memorial Day weekend, much of the bank's cash had been sent ahead to the Federal Reserve. Crushed, they realized that their big score was not working out according to plan. With break of dawn, it was time for retreat, though Clemente certainly was far from throwing in the towel. The crew left Joe Banks' house to strategize on the way forward. Clemente, not dissuaded by the slight haul, recognized that they still had 2 more nights left to crack open as many safety deposit boxes as possible. Unlike most burglars who would have, under similar circumstances, quit and run, Clemente and his crew felt almost invincible, absorbed in their inside information and recognizing that they even had policemen in their corner. Thus, nobody was ever going to find the crime. The 2 guys went back to the vault and perfected their technique, dumping the slower methodology for breaking open those locks and using chisels and hammers to break the hinges off the deposit boxes. For 2 nights, the 2 picked away, breaking open approximately 1,000 safety deposit boxes, netting close to $2 million in cash. Real treasures, however, were rare and costly pieces of jewelry and jewelries, pink diamonds, exclusive watches, and precious things. Tired but thrilled to the bones, they pulled out all the loot from the vaulting, all under the protection of the police officers in their gang. After 72 hours of working their teeth loose, Clemente and his team took home $10 million in cash and jewels. They split the cash on the spot 6 ways, so each one got a little over $200,000. The jewels were a little harder to split up. This jewel was worth a lot, but mostly it was identified, so if they tried selling it, they were taking a risk. A consensus was reached among them that Clemente would take the jewels with him to leave with Joe Banks until they could figure out how to convert it safely into cash. Although the gang had successfully accomplished the heist, they had to face much more challenging situations. When the bank manager entered the vault the morning after the robbery and saw that papers were scattered everywhere and boxes were stacked up to the knees, he knew things were badly amiss. Sergeant Tom Dye, who had acted as the lookout for the gang during the commission of the crime, was now in a flawless position to take charge of overseeing the crime scene investigation. It would thus keep Clemente better informed about the progress the FBI had so far made. Suspicion quickly fell on the possibility of an inside job, especially because it was an attack with a methodological approach and knowledge needed to carry out the heist. Daichai and Clemente were interviewed in the course of interrogations that followed, but with nothing concrete against them. Clemente, assured of his ability to avoid being caught, continued to insist on his alibi. His mistress, Barbara Hickey, was instructed to back up his alibi, insisting that he had been with her on the nights of the burglary. The FBI was suspicious enough, but they had nothing to physically connect Clemente to the break-in. Clemente, being a police captain, knew exactly how to exploit the system, being all too aware of police procedures and even the rules of evidence. He was confident that so long as nothing could be proved against him by the authorities, he was safe. The FBI placed Clemente under 24-hour surveillance, but in this situation also, he was not even ruffled and maintained his cool and composed nature, knowing that the authorities had him under keen observation. His hubris grew because he believed that no one could catch him. With the statute of limitations running out for the burglary, Clemente just had to hang in there a little longer, after which he would be scot-free from any prosecution. Each day reduced the chances of the authorities taking any action against Clemente, but at the very moment when all seemed to be at a standstill, the gang started to fall apart from the inside. Tom Dye and Joe Banks, both men heavily into cocaine use, were becoming paranoid and skeptical of one another. The added tensions from their situation and substance use broke down their relationship. Things had reached a boiling point, and in a particularly heated confrontation, guns were drawn. In a shattering irony, it was Joe Banks who was shot by Dee. That shooting sent waves through the gang and totally threw them into chaos in their operation. What would have been the perfect crime was threatening to collapse. The pent-up tension between the gang members began to boil over. When police arrived to investigate the murder of Joe Banks, they discovered drugs and stolen jewelry in his car. The stolen jewelry turned out to be the material evidence that led them to associate Banks with the depositor's trust theft, thus providing an opening for the police to follow the trail of the infamous burglary. Having now spotted their man, the police stepped up the pressure on Banks, while other men of Jerry Clemente's gang felt themselves increasingly burdened by legal problems. The pressure on the gang heightened since Clemente was now under the most serious threat to his criminal business. Although there was chaos all around, Clemente did not lose his cool, since he believed that as long as every single member of his crew could remain cool, they would definitely get out of the probing without suffering a single scrape. They knew that with the recovery of the stolen jewelry, he and his corrupt band of cops would surely be brought down hard by the police. It was no ordinary crime. It was one of the most gigantic heists of the century, and to make it even brash and bold, lawmen took part in it. The authorities were indeed eager to do justice to those who had been brazen enough to breach the public's trust. As the police closed their case against Clemente, Tommy Day came up for trial on the shooting of Joe Banks. Cross-examination continued with Day's lawyer going tough on Banks over the evidence that had been revealed in his car. Finally, when Dye's lawyer asked him whether the jewelry belonged to him, fed up with the questions from the lawyer, Banks boasted that he had stolen the jewelry. It was jewelry, he admitted in open court, taken on Memorial Day weekend of 1980, yes sir. A scream could be heard throughout the courtroom with this admission. It marked a change of direction for the case, one that would give the prosecution a significant break. DHI was guilty, and in light of Joe Banks's conviction, he began cooperating with prosecutors and expounding further on the real depositors' trust robbery. But this convict brought a lot of baggage with his spotty past, which makes his testimony controversial. The authorities realized that relying solely on the testimony of Banks would not serve a conviction against Clemente. Then, the case takes another critical turn when investigators learn that Clemente had a breakup with his longtime mistress, Barbara Hickey. At first, Hickey was uncooperative and unwilling to implicate Clemente. However, at the point where she would not talk, she made the crucial statement that cracked the case wide open. She casually remarked that one night over Memorial Day weekend, Clemente came home covered in dust and dirt, cement powder all over his clothing. It was a flimsy detail, but what investigators needed to connect Clemente directly to the break-in. To Clemente, Hickey's betrayal was the worst possibility that he could imagine. With her testimony, the very finely constructed facade he had maintained for so long came crashing down. Soon thereafter, Clemente was arrested, and various counts of breaking and entering with the intent to commit a felony. Mounting evidence notwithstanding, Clemente appeared about as unconcerned as one would think possible. He even believed then that he had planned the perfect crime, and that no authoritative figures could ever prove him guilty beyond a doubt. It was the depth of his knowledge in police procedures as well as how he could manipulate the system which gave him confidence. He had planned every detail of the heist and got the key players involved. He felt that his tracks were covered right enough not to get convicted, but such arrogance proved to be his downfall. At the trial of Clemente, Barbara Hickey was to become the star prosecution witness. She testified about Clemente's comments that had surfaced in the months running up to the heist. She recalled how he had boasted that soon he would have enough money that he would never have to work again. His sentencing of 30 to 40 years in prison, the maximum for his crimes, sealed the fate of this once almighty policeman. For the authorities, Clemente's conviction was particularly sweet. Taking down a corrupt cop who had abused his position in such an obvious way was a big win. To start with, Clemente hadn't committed a crime. He had compromised the whole system of trust he had sworn to uphold. Today, he is unemployed, fighting for the police pension, far from the life of luxury and invincibility that he once envisioned. Clemente spent 10 years in prison and was paroled. So now moving to our next case, Rick Luss, once a respected friend of politicians and a world-class aviation expert, would later become infamous as one of America's most successful drug smugglers, overseeing the transport of more than 10 tons of cocaine into the United States and raking in billions. His journey from good citizen to leading Medellin cartel figure was equal parts genius and desperation. Rick Luss demonstrated his obsession with flying quite early in life. He even acquired his commercial pilot's license before high school graduation. He excelled both in flying as well as the knowledge of airplane mechanics. After college, which he graduated with a degree in aeronautics in the late 1970s, he opened his business, Air America, located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The company primarily specialized in luxury upgrades for private and corporate planes, targeting high-valued clients who were interested in long-range modifications to their aircraft, such as extended fuel tanks, to avoid frequent refueling stops. Air America was booming, once again, expertly crafted for a time. Rick paid his workers well, and he became locally notorious as a good businessman and generous man. He even ingratiated himself with local politicians. Enough to fly around the state governor on official business, for example. Luss was one of the boys in the community, donating to local charities, being friends with the police, and so on. It wasn't long before the recession began to catch up with Air America, though. His corporate clients dwindled precipitously, and Rick found himself strapped for cash to keep his business going. And that desperation led him to increasingly shady clients involved in activities of varying degrees of illegality. They would ask for modifications on their planes, including secret compartments designed specifically to transport contraband. One of these clients paid Rick with a bag of Quaaludes instead of cash. Bankrupt, Luss tried to sell the Quaaludes to get by. Unfortunately for him, one of the first sales he made was to an undercover cop. Rick was arrested, but authorities soon realized that he was not a big-time player in the drug trade. He was just a broke businessman in the wrong place at the wrong time. The D, however, thought that Air America was not doing its job to prevent its planes from being used as vehicles for drug traffickers to modify aircraft for smuggling missions. They offered Rick a deal if he pleaded down. Instead of going to jail, Rick would report any suspicious activity at his shop. Rick had little choice but to take the deal. As part of his new arrangement with the DEA, he became an informant. Not long after, he came to realize that the DEA was right. All those many clients, all these drug smugglers making a great deal more money than Rick himself. One such questionable customer walked into Rick's shop in 1981 with a proposition Rick simply could not refuse: a lot of money to fly for a Tampa-based marijuana smuggling ring. Here was a chance, Rick had decided, to make some easy money and perhaps save his seemingly insolvent business. But the risk of flying for the ring quickly began to surface. It was rough. What little organization it had was sloppy at fuel setups and flight routes crawling with DEA patrols. Despite the danger, Rick's flying skills were enough to bring in the aircraft and mission to complete as good as bring home the bacon. 2 more smuggle flights convinced him to quit, but as a professional and with the expertise did not go unnoticed. His performance came to the attention of Jorge Ochoa, one of the main leaders of the Medellin cartel, the criminal organization that dominated the world's largest portion of the cocaine traffic. He promised Rick a lifetime opportunity, both financially and in the level of risk. The cartel had an urgent necessity for a professional pilot to fly large quantities of cocaine into the United States. Ochoa guaranteed Lewis a few $1 million as recompense, but swore to leave him with a life-changing threat. "If you cheat us, we'll kill you." Rick accepted the offer, knowing that death would await him or his betrayal. The challenge was enormous. The flight from Pennsylvania to Colombia was more than 6,000 miles, and the planes Rick had access to weren't able to make that trip non-stop. Making the stop to refuel would be a huge risk, as it would very easily tip off authorities. Non-stop flights of bigger planes that could make the trip were under heavy surveillance by law enforcement agencies in the U.S. Using all his knowledge of aircraft, Rick began to modify small aircraft, specifically the Cessna 310, into what he described as long-range smuggling aircraft. Usually, such aircraft have a range of about 900 miles without refueling. Rick stretched that range dramatically by modifying the aircraft. The first modification that Rick applied was to increase the fuel capacity of the aircraft. He inserted rubber fuel bladders in every empty space of the aircraft: the nose, the space under the floor of the cabin, in the luggage compartments, and even in certain hollow areas of the wings. This transmogrification enabled the plane to carry 3 times more fuel than had initially been specified. He beefed up the wings, landing gear, and wheel struts to carry the added weight while replacing the engines for stronger units that would have sufficient thrust to balance the weight. These specially modified planes, in effect, became flying fuel tanks. To be sure the cops would not suspect them, Rick took it further. He obtained an FAA certificate that declared all of the modifications legal. This meant that even if law enforcement inspected the planes, they had no probable cause to believe aircraft were involved in smuggling. The big challenge in front of him was flying through the U.S. without the aid of any surveillance system, as the DAS had installed a modern radar system to track aircraft going in and out of Florida and along the Gulf Coast, and they were catching many drug smugglers. But Rick was a step ahead of them. He fitted his custom radar systems comboss in the planes that would detect the onset of government patrols and weather conditions. He could change his flight course while flying based on this information. To make absolutely sure he was being successful in his operations, Rick bribed a corrupt customs agent who provided him valuable intelligence such as the exact locations of radar installations, flight paths, and schedules of all coastal patrol aircraft. With this information, Rick could plot routes that avoided detection, flying through gaps in the DEA's security net. Rick also constructed a cover communications network. By radios extending from Colombia to the US, he and his contacts in the cartel communicated in coded language. This allowed him to stay in contact with the cartel while he flew, so he can pivot plans in real time if any unforeseen complications came up. There, Rick Luss ran his smuggling operation for years, flying billions of dollars worth of cocaine into the United States with an apparent success rate at avoiding detection. But as with any typical criminal enterprise, it was bound to happen. Rick's luck eventually would run out. The DEA had become suspicious of his planning and meticulous operations. The amount of drugs entering the country could not go unnoticed much longer. Eventually, one of Rick's associates made a mistake, and the authorities began to close in on his operation. Rick Luss was, in a way, not only a pilot, but a well-thought-of and intelligent operator. He had spent months planning each detail to the finest point and was ready for his first shipment to Colombia. Rick set off on his first trip, flying direct into Colombia 13 hours later, and then landed in the Colombian jungle where the cartel loaded 800 pounds of cocaine into his small Cessna 310. But it wasn't just the volume, of course. The plane was now 2,000 pounds heavier than its recommended limit, and getting it airborne from an unpaved runway, surrounded by trees, made it a pretty hazardous game. Many smugglers died in such conditions, as the very topography forbade their planes from taking off. However, Rick advanced changes to his plane's engines and horsepower, allowed him to take off, just enough clearing the trees. Upon taking air, Rick took a different flight route. He used the 73rd Meridian route, never questioned by lawmen. This was the inspired part of Rick's plan. He had reckoned that extra fuel would allow him to expand the range of the plane, reach a point beyond the ordinary radar scan reach, and thus pass completely unnoticed by the Naval Patrol. Even with careful planning, 5 hours into the return flight, Rick's custom-built radar detection system indicated a Navy tracker plane was behind him. Unintimidated, Rick used an aggressive play. Utilizing his weather radar, he noticed an electrical storm nearby. Aware that law enforcement planes would probably avoid the storm, Rick chose to fly straight into it. Whereas most pilots in that situation would have gone around the squall line, Master Pilot Rick went through it. His bold action paid off. The Navy plane refused to follow him into the storm, and he made a successful evasion of capture. 2 hours later, after emerging from the storm, Rick flew below radar and made his way to an abandoned commuter landing strip. Inching toward the runway, Rick deployed one of his characteristic tactics. Rather than landing immediately, he climbed sharply to 1,500 feet. The first time he would be visible on radar. This would give him the illusion of being just another routine commuter flight, ending its normal commute with an innocent landing. He would radio Scranton Control, requesting they record his flight as a short, harmless commuter hop. Again, Rick succeeded in eluding law enforcement and landed and debarked 800 pounds of cocaine, reaping over 1 million handu for his efforts from the Medellin cartel. Within a year's time, Rick had become a reliable smuggler for the Medellin cartel and would regularly travel to Colombia and back. Rick always felt that money was one way of financing his adventurous lifestyle. He also loved that his operation functioned in an efficient manner. He quipped that he was the Federal Express of the dope trade, noting that he could deliver a large amount of narcotics to the minute anywhere in the world. The cartel took significant notice of his attention to detail. One day, Rick and his crew were geared up for a 5th delivery, but the Colombians had to ask them to hold because they ran out of product. They exhausted their supplies, as Rick was bringing in deliveries so fast. The Colombians were satisfied with Rick's reliability to such an extent that they gave him a salary increase, and Rick increased the scale of his operation by hiring other pilots and increasing his flights. He continued to be at more risk but became used to the smuggling process, getting bolder in each run. His operation was so reliable that they never lost a flight, never crashed, and always delivered the drugs on time. Unaware of the DEA, who still had no idea of Rick's actual involvement with the cartel, they continued to liaise with him on affairs related to the drug trade. Rick was very choosy on what he told them, thus always giving them only just enough to keep his cover, but not enough to betray his smuggling activities. He fed the DEA information strategically by keeping just enough to soothe their doubts, but not too much to become suspicious of himself and his contacts in the cartel. Disaster hit in 1984. The Tampa pot smuggling ring, to whom Rick had flown his first smuggling runs, busted him. Rick was indicted, along with 15 other defendants, and sent to Florida for trial. His defense strategy was bold. Rick claimed that he had flown those marijuana runs only sola, to gather intelligence for the DEA, meaning that he had been operating in the best interest of the law even as he was hauling dope. His charisma and contacts worked once again. His DEA handlers were so convinced of his innocence that they came out to testify on his behalf, vouching for his upstanding character and even writing letters recommending him. Although Rick had much to worry about in terms of legal battles, he was far more concerned by how the Colombians would take this matter. As a measure of showing them that he was not informing the law on his matters, Rick ensured that he was still running his cocaine runs even during the trial. Every weekend, Rick would fly his lawyers back to Scranton, then board another plane to Colombia, fill with 200-300 kilos of cocaine, and then return to the U.S. In doing so, he managed to keep the trust of the cartel even when he had his trial in Florida. With his remarkable skill in managing both his DEA informant identity and his smuggling business at the same time, Rick Luss was living on borrowed time. His business, though efficient and well-run, could not be kept hidden for long. He was bringing such enormous quantities into the U.S. and becoming too visible to ignore that he was a target, of course. But for now, at least, Rick Luss kept flying high at the top of the smuggling game, an unmatched pilot and logistics genius, whose crime empire he had constructed while flying so literally, as well as figuratively, beneath the radar. For an 11 weeks out of his trial, Rick kept up his brazen dual existence. Using the subterfuge of appearing in court during the week, Rick took trips to Colombia on weekends to smuggle cocaine. This venture made him a cool $13 million, which would see Rick become the only defendant in the case ever acquitted by a jury. Rick had millions of dollars piling up from his smuggling ventures, and he needed a way to launder the money. He turned to Michael Coffey, a banker in Scranton, to assist in concealing his illegal profits. Coffey helped Rick by not filling out proper documentation on transfers into offshore accounts, allowing Rick to stash his cash without raising red flags. Coffey's ambition led him to earn a little extra for these services, but the arrangement soon unraveled. Rick's smuggling operation was seriously rocked by Hyjim Cooper, a fellow pilot and associate, when he crashed his airplane into the car of a man waiting to assist in the offload of the drugs. The smash killed the man waiting in the car. He was waiting to assist in an offload and had all the earmarks of a man doing nothing more than waiting to assist in the offload, so long as he waited in his car on some dark, isolated stretch of road. It happened because Cooper was high on cocaine and lost control. This led to Cooper's charges for felony murder and his first call being to Rick to request assistance. All this was accessible to Rick, who could settle the score with Cooper or assist him and his girlfriend dispose of all of these and vanish from the officers and the law, but instead did nothing. Under sentence of up to 20 years in prison, Cooper cut a deal with the authorities: his freedom against cooperation. Cooper gave the incriminating data about Rick's smuggling operation for his part. Using the trail of evidence Cooper had just unearthed, the DASOS began following Rick's organization of smuggling through paper investigations that included all traceable material, like fuel receipts, radio equipment purchases to link him with massive smuggling operations. A money laundering expert was consulted to study Rick's banking transactions, and it began to quite evidently emerge that this enormous amount of money he had amassed could no longer be hidden. Realizing that the authorities were closing in, Rick immediately wired 30 million hogs to the island of St. Eustatius in the Caribbean, a haven without an extradition treaty with the U.S. He then fled to the island himself, hoping to escape prosecution. For Rick, his plot to disappear into St. Eustatius never occurred. With evidence provided by the locals, in coordination with local law enforcement, the DASOT worked together to bring in Rick for some of his illegal activities. Despite the island not having an extradition treaty, the government acquiesced in deporting Rick as an undesirable alien. In 1996, Rick was apprehended by local police, taken to the airport, and turned over to U.S. authorities. Once in U.S. airspace, Rick was informed he was actually being placed under arrest. Rick was indicted for conspiracy to smuggle cocaine, and if convicted, he would face 345 years in prison. Seeking to avoid such a long sentence, Rick made a deal with the DEA in which he agreed to cooperate and provide them with full details of his operations, including where he had hidden all his cash. This resulted in more than 21 million sasmirs in seized cash and assets. Rick also turned in his members of his smuggling team. Each of them would end up serving prison time. Despite this, Rick received a commuted sentence of 1-2 years for his crimes. Rick Luss was a paradox himself, a man who everybody described as Christopher Columbus for his bold explorations and Charles Lindbergh for his extraordinary flying ability. He was willing to take enormous risks, reaching out for experiences and knowledge day after day. In the world of drug smuggling, he was considered a genius, outsmarting the authorities time and again. But his smuggling was causing irreparable damage through smuggling in tons of cocaine. Rick himself was accountable for the agony of thousands of individuals, from drug addicts to families broken by the use of drugs. Since his release from prison, Rick reportedly went straight by starting a new life in Florida. Ironically, he apparently lives in a place called Smuggler's Cove, an appropriate location under the circumstances. Rick's career as a smuggler was brilliant and recklessly dangerous, yet it made him one of the most infamous drug pilots in American history.